Okay, proceeding through the canonical organization of a course on cognition, let's move from perception to memory. The principal theme of the lectures on social perception was that through our perceptual apparatus, we form a more or less coherent, unified representation of social objects. For example, people and their characteristics, their states, their behaviors, and so on. And the next thing that happens is that we store this information in memory. Now, there are lots of different aspects of social memory, or what's sometimes called person memory, that we could talk about. But what I want to focus on in these two lectures, because we lose a third lecture because of the holidays, is what the mental representation looks like. That is, once we've got some knowledge, we've acquired some knowledge of a person through through perceptual processes, we then store that knowledge in memory, and what we want to know is, what does that representation look like? So let's just kind of pick up from the beginning here, that what we want to do in perception is to form this mental representation of objects and events that are experienced in the social world, in the environment, so that our behavior is governed by the meaning of the stimulus. Now, this is an important conceptual distinction between mere sensation on the one hand and perception on the other. Sensation isn't concerned with the nature of the stimulus. All sensation is really concerned with is how you transduce the pattern of stimulus energies radiating from a stimulus into a neural impulse. To take a kind of basic example, we've got a basic sensory mechanism that picks up the tap of the patellar tendon, and it doesn't matter whether it's a hand that taps the patellar tendon, or a doctor's hammer, or a book, or a telephone pole, or anything. The nature of the stimulus doesn't really, the meaning of the stimulus doesn't matter. The meaning of the stimulus really becomes critical when we start talking about perception. And this is especially the case when we consider that from a cognitive point of view, every act of perception involves an act of categorization. This is one of the great aphorisms from Jerome Bruner. It's one of my favorite psychological aphorisms. But what Bruner really meant was the act of perceiving an object isn't complete when we've simply identified its form and its location and whether it's moving or not, the kinds of things that are usually considered when we talk about perception. But rather, perception entails identifying the object, determining what it actually is that's out there, and how it's similar to some objects and different from others. That's what categorization is all about. So memory is in part relevant to the problem of person perception and impression formation, precisely because memory provides the conceptual knowledge that allows categorization to occur. You can't classify an object, a new object, as similar to some things and different from other things unless you know something about those other things. And that knowledge is stored in memory. So, okay, the function of memory, whether it's social memory or non-social memory, is simply to retain mental representation of an object or an event so that you can actually deal with that representation in the absence of the stimulus. The whole point of learning and memory is to permit people to behave in the absence of some kind of stimulus. If we required a physical stimulus to be present in the environment, we'd just be reflex machines, right? Be no serious difference between us and the thermostat that turns on your furnace in your apartment or your house. We're able to guide our behavior by stored knowledge, even in the absence of the stimulus. J.M. Barrie, the great English author, writer of Peter Pan, was once asked what the point of memory is, and being British, he said, the whole purpose of God gave us memory so that we could have roses in December. All right? Roses don't grow in England in December, but by virtue of memory, we can have them all the time, even if they're not present. Okay, so first, Memory provides the cognitive background for perception, okay? Memory is where our fund of knowledge and expectations and beliefs is stored that is part of the perceiver's contribution to the process of perception. Moreover, the contents of memory are changed by virtue of perceptual activity. Perceiving an object, perceiving an event, leaves a trace of that object or event in memory. And you can think about this memory trace in a number of different ways. Some people think about the memory trace as being a record of the perceptual operations that were performed on a stimulus. Other theorists think about the memory trace as a kind of description of the percept. And it's that view of memory that's going to serve as the basis for these particular lectures. Okay, so what do we mean by memory? Well, turns out memory is a very big topic, and there are lots of different kinds of memory. I find it convenient to classify different forms of memory using this particular scheme. First, classifying the knowledge stored in memory in terms of whether it's declarative in nature or procedural in nature. We'll talk mostly about declarative memory in this course. And then procedural memory can be subclassified as motor procedures and cognitive procedures. Declarative memory can be classified as episodic and semantic. Declarative memory is factual. Declarative memory is factual knowledge. It's knowledge that can be represented in the form of propositions, sentence-like propositions. There are two different kinds of declarative knowledge. Episodic knowledge, is our declarative knowledge about specific events, events that occurred in a unique place in space and time. So if I say to you, I had chicken Santa Cruz for dinner last night, that refers to a particular thing that I did in a particular place and a particular time. Whereas semantic memory is abstract and context-free. Semantic memory is factual memory, but it doesn't refer to any particular event or any particular episode in anybody's life. If I tell you chicken Santa Cruz is made with a lot of peppers and some cilantro and things like that, that's just a fact about a recipe. It doesn't refer to any particular event. But those are all different kinds of factual knowledge. Procedural memory, procedural knowledge stored in memory, refers to rules and skills, procedures that allow us to get from one place to another cognitively. So, for example, we have in our heads motor procedures. All of you know how to tie your shoes. At least I hope most of you by now know how to tie your shoes. And that knowledge, which is you make a loop and you put the one over the other and all that stuff that you learn to do as kids and that you may teach your own kids to do at some point, that's a motor procedure that is recorded in memory. Motor procedures for driving a standard shift car, that's recorded in procedural memory. But we also have cognitive procedures, rules that apply to purely mental operations, how to add and subtract, how to do long division, how to take square roots without going to a calculator for it, things like that. These aren't facts exactly, they are rules for action. And it's these rules for action that make up the contents of procedural memory. Okay. We can think about all of this in the social domain as well. So, for example, we have in our social memories a number of different motor procedures, knowledge about how to do various kinds of things in the social domain. So, for example, in every culture there are rules for eye contact. You're supposed to look at the people you're talking to. You're not supposed to look at them for too long because it makes them nervous, but you're not supposed to turn your head away and do all sorts of things like that. There's a rule for how to make eye contact. We have rules for hand grip. When you shake somebody's hand, typically you use your right hand, not your left hand, but you're not supposed to hang onto it for too long, and you're not supposed to grip it too tight. If you grip it too tight, or your grip is too loose, or you hang on to it for too long, or you don't hang on to it long enough, people start thinking weird things about you. So we've got these rules. Display rules for emotion are another set of social procedures. Rules for maintaining interpersonal distance. In every culture, there's a distance that's just too close. It's a violation of personal space, and you're supposed to back off from that a little bit. We also have purely mental procedures stored in memory. The procedures that we use for forming an impression about a person, or procedures for self-regulation. If you're feeling kind of blue and unhappy, you have some sense of what you can do to perk yourself up. Those are mental procedures that are involved, that are intended to change your state from one state to another. So in social cognition, we've got a lot of procedural knowledge. We don't know too much about that, okay? So those of you who want to go on in this field, there's a really good area of study. We know a lot about the rules for impression formation, but not about most of this other stuff. On the declarative side, we have a lot of declarative social knowledge. On the semantic end, we have, first and foremost, our implicit theories of personality. Remember, we defined implicit personality theory as the judge's description of the generalized other. Not of any particular person, but just kind of what people are like in general. What are the basic personality traits, and where do people in general stand on them? That's semantic knowledge about the social domain. And then we have, I'm sorry, this should say episodic. That's my mistake. Episodic knowledge about various people, their behaviors, and especially autobiographical memory, knowledge about our own behaviors and experiences. These are episodic memories because they refer to particular things that happen to particular people at particular times and in particular places. These lectures are going to focus on declarative memory, so we want to make clear exactly what we're talking about here. First, because all declarative memory, whether it's episodic or semantic, has truth value, okay? It's factual knowledge. It's either true or false. If I say to you, neurotic people are anxious, well, that's either true or false. It's a declarative statement about neurotic people. If I say to you, Lutherans tend to be neurotic, that's a factual statement. It's not true. Lutherans are no more neurotic than anybody else, but it's a factual statement, right? If I believe that, that's a piece of declarative knowledge. Okay, so all factual knowledge can be given a sentence-like propositional representation that consists of, like a sentence, a subject and a verb, or a relation, rather, and an object, subject and an object, and some relationship between them. You can think about all declarative knowledge as taking the form, the subject verbed the object, okay? John gave a present to Lucy. John is a neurotic extrovert, or whatever it is, okay? There are always some kind of sentence-like structure, and these can be embedded in a propositional network, of which I'll show you some examples in a minute. But here are some examples. John smiled at Lucy. John verbed Lucy, okay? John is a neurotic extrovert. John verbed neurotic extrovert. Neurotics are anxious and excitable. Extroverts are talkative and sociable. All of these pieces of factual knowledge can be described in fairly simple sentences. Okay. In cognitive psychology and cognitive science, we have a particular way of representing declarative knowledge in terms of an associative network structure. It's very popular in cognitive psychology and cognitive science, where nodes in the network represent concepts, things like John, Lucy, neurotic extrovert, and so on, and associative links represent the relationships between and among these kinds of concepts. So the idea is that when you perceive something, suppose you observe John giving a present to Lucy, what will happen is that act of perception will activate nodes in a pre-existing memory network corresponding to John and Lucy and giving and present, okay? And then that activation will kind of spread across associative links to activate related activate related concepts. And this activation that spreads through the associative network creates a phenomenon called priming, which we're going to talk about quite a bit in this class next time we meet, which is a major piece of evidence about the structure of associative memory. But all priming effects basically entail a situation where processing one event typically facilitates the processing of another event. There's negative priming where processing one event impairs the processing of another event. We're not going to talk about negative priming. But the idea is that if you see John give a present to Lucy, okay, you've activated your John node and your Lucy node and your present node in memory, and then what's going to happen is you're going to find it easier to think about things that are related to those concepts by virtue of activation that spreads throughout an associative network. Here is how we would represent a propositional representation graphically. This, believe it or not, one of the most famous sentences in all of cognitive psychology. Okay? An entire book was written about this sentence. Very famous book, really wonderful book by John Anderson. The hippie touched the debutante. Okay? Just a fact, represents some kind of event in the world. So here you have a node representing the hippie, and you have a node representing the debutante, and you have an associative link that represents the relationship between them, the fact that the hippie touched this debutante. Here is an alternative way of representing exactly the same kind of information. Here at the top you have a node that represents the proposition itself, and then it is linked to nodes representing the various elements of the proposition. There's a subject link to hippie, there's a relation link to touched, and there is an object link to debutante. These are two, for our purposes, they're equivalent ways of representing declarative knowledge graphically. We're going to make a lot of use of this kind of notation in these two lectures, but for simply for purposes of simplicity, we're going to gravitate towards this very simple notation where there are nodes in the network representing concepts and associative links between nodes that represent the relations between objects. Here is an example of this kind of the semantic network from a recent paper by Tim Rogers and Jay McClelland after a famous model in cognitive psychology proposed by Collins and Quillian. And what you've got here is a network representing people's knowledge about living things. So living things can grow, living things are living, plant is a living thing, animal is a living thing, tree is a plant, flower is a plant, bird is an animal, fish is an animal, sunfish is a fish, robin is a bird, birds can fly, birds have wings. All of your knowledge about birds and fish and trees and flowers can be recorded in a network like this where nodes represent concepts and associative links represent associations between them. This is a very, very, very popular way of thinking about semantic memory. Now, just in passing, it's not the only way to think about this, okay? There's an alternative representational format known as connectionist modeling, which can represent the same kind of knowledge in a very different form. We are not going to deal with this in this course, okay? The only reason I mention it at all is that Fisk and Taylor do. They talk about the proceduralist or connectionist models of social memory, and this is what one looks like. I'll put some information up in the lecture supplements about this, but I really do not want to take time to talk about it now. Okay, we're going to stick with our tried and true associative networks, and this is kind of what a piece of your associative network might look like. Okay, you've got our sentence, this famous sentence, the hippie touched the debutante, okay? And then there are associative links that fan out to associated concepts. So hippies drive Volkswagen buses, okay? Debutantes drive Porsches. Hippies have long, stringy hair, okay? Debutantes have long, blonde hair. Hair comes in two forms, long and short. Long hair comes in two forms, stringy and blonde. Vehicles come in two forms, truck and car. The cars come in two forms, Porsches and Volkswagen buses, and so on and so forth. You got to get a sense of how these items are represented, so that if you actually see a hippie touch a debutante, okay, the idea is that by virtue of spreading activation, you can make inferences about, you know, the hippie drives the VW bus, and the debutante has long blonde hair, and so on and so forth. This is how knowledge, okay, is brought to bear on our perception and impression formation. Okay, so that's basically it. Just want to say one more thing about procedural memory, which is that all procedural knowledge can be represented by goals and conditions and actions that achieve the goals, okay? If you want to drive a standard shift car, if you want to put a standard shift car in first you have to press the clutch down, okay? It's rules like that. The goals and conditions of procedural knowledge are represented by nodes in semantic memory, okay? Moreover, according to at least one prominent theory of procedural knowledge, all procedural knowledge begins as kind of a list of things to do, like your grocery list or your to-do list for the weekend around the house, and that with a lot of practice, you develop a lot of expertise, the knowledge changes its format from declarative format to the procedural format. We don't have to go through this. I just want to touch bases about procedural knowledge. Okay, now, forget automaticity for a moment. Let's keep our focus on declarative memory and the kinds of declarative memory that we encounter in the social case. One form, as I mentioned before, is what we think of as autobiographical memory, okay? Where you have, in your head, you have a record of specific things that you've done, specific experiences that you've had. Each of these events, each of these episodes are located at a particular place in a particular time. So what would an autobiographical memory look like? Okay. Well, first, there'd be a propositional description of the event. Okay. John gave a present to Lucy. Then there would be some representation of episodic context. John gave a present to Lucy for Valentine's Day. Okay, so that specifies where it occurred. He gave it to her at home, the place it occurred, the causal relations. John gave Lucy a present because it was Valentine's Day and he knows he's supposed to. John gave Lucy a present on Valentine's Day because he said the wrong thing at the party the other night and he's trying to make up. Whatever caused him to do this. And then, of course, the causal implications go on from there. But all autobiographical memory has some other really interesting feature, which is that all autobiographical memory, by definition, has self-reference. The self is in there someplace. The hippie touched the debutante is not an autobiographical memory. That's a description of something that happened to somebody else. But if I say to you, I saw a hippie touch a debutante in the park, that's now an autobiographical memory. That's something about me. Or if I say to you, I was the hippie that touched the debutante in the park, that's also an autobiographical memory. That's something that I did. Or with a couple of changes, I could say, I was the debutante that the hippie touched, okay? Again, that would be an autobiographical memory. What's essential to an autobiographical memory is self-reference, and this self-reference comes in a number of forms. The self can be represented either as the agent or the patient of some action. So if the memory is, I gave a present to Lucy, I'm the agent of the present giving. If if the memory is Lucy gave a present to me, I'm the patient of the present giving. Those of you who have taken a course in linguistics will recognize these as Charles Fillmore's semantic roles. Okay, that's where this comes from. Okay. Or I can be the stimulus of some experience. Okay, I made Lucy happy. I'm the stimulus. Okay, for her happiness. Or Lucy made me happy. I'm the experiencer of happiness, where Lucy was the stimulus. So somehow in autobiographical memory, the self is represented in one of these four roles. And if Fillmore is right, these four roles exhaust all the possible roles. You're either the agent or the patient of some action, or you're the stimulus or experiencer of some state. The other thing that gets represented in autobiographical memory, which doesn't necessarily get represented in other forms of episodic memory, is the internal state of the self. Okay? What's my cognitive state? What did I believe, okay, when I gave this present? Or what did I feel when I gave this present? Or what did I want when I gave this present? So the self is represented as well as the internal states that are associated with the self. Autobiographical memory, with this more or less explicit self-reference, is to be distinguished from semantic memory in the social domain, which is more, as I say, more abstract and context-free. So there's a lot of categorical knowledge about the social world. We're going to talk about that in the next set of lectures. There are also all sorts of other abstract, context-free knowledge about the social world that we have. Is that a question? Yeah. It's free of episodic context is what I mean by that. So if I say to you, extroverts are talkative and sociable, that's just true of extroverts. It's not true of any particular extrovert, it's true of all extroverts. It's not true of extroverts on Thursday, it's true of extroverts on all the other days of the week. It's not true of extroverts in Norway, it's true of extroverts wherever they are. So if I say to you, John behaved in a very extroverted way at the party Saturday night, well, that's a context-specific statement. And you might say to it, wow, what was going on? He never behaves in an extroverted way. Well, he did on Saturday night at the party, right? So it's in episodic memory, the context specifies the conditions under which it's true. The statement is true, okay? But the larger point here is that in episodic memory, there's always a specification of context in terms of the time or place that some event happened. But in semantic social memory, if there is a context, it's much broader than that. You might have a context that says something like, well, Norwegian extroverts behave in this way, Swedish extroverts behave in this way. All right, there's context there, but it still applies to all Norwegian extroverts and all Swedish extroverts. It's not the same kind of context. Okay, good point. Now, where were we going with this? Where we were going with this, okay, is that, again, there are relations between episodic and semantic memory in much the same way that there are relations between procedural and declarative memory. If it's true that all of our semantic knowledge about the world, the social world, is acquired through perception and learning, then it follows from that all of our semantic knowledge began in episodic memory, okay? So I meet this person, John, and I observe him behaving in an extroverted way, and I say, well, you know, John behaved in an extroverted way on Thursday, and then I see him again, and he's behaving in an extroverted way again, and I see him a third time, he's behaving in an extroverted way then as well. Pretty soon, all those little episodes glom together, a technical term, glom together, and pretty soon you've got a semantic statement that says, John's an extrovert, okay? There's no context There's no context there. There's just this flat-footed statement that John is an extrovert. Moreover, all our episodic memories are formed against a background of semantic knowledge. Our world knowledge forms a basis for perception, and it also forms the cognitive basis for episodic memory. Okay, so now, having taken that much time, let's look at a little bit at exactly what memory for a person, our knowledge of a person, would look like in this associative network the system. And again, just as a footnote, you can do the same thing with a connectionist network. It's just not nearly as easy to talk about and not nearly as easy to present, and I'm not doing it that way for that reason, but I'm also not doing it that way because almost all of the research in person memory has been based on one or another variant of a straightforward traditional associative network model of memories. So, if I ask you what you know about some other person, your roommate, your boyfriend, your wife, whatever, okay, what you'll find is that your knowledge about that person represents a kind of mix of semantic memories, knowledge about what that person is like in general. John is a neurotic extrovert, and episodic memories, your knowledge of specific events and experiences that pertain to that person. John gave a present to Lucy. John stumbled in the parking lot, or whatever it is. So we got episodic memories of that person's past experiences and actions, and we've got semantic memory, which represents kind of generic knowledge about that person. And the question is, what do person memories look like? Okay? And the answer is, from an associative the network structure, person memories look kind of like this. You've got a node representing the person, James Bartlett. He's a psychologist at the University of Texas, and for reasons of history, a bunch of us use him as an example in our lectures. Not for any reason, but that's why, okay? I think it's because it reminds us of William James and Frederick C. Bartlett, but I'm not sure why we do this. It's just a tradition. Okay, and James Bartlett, he's kind, and he's thoughtless. Actually, he's not, but that's how we do it. Okay, so that's semantic knowledge about James Bartlett. And then we have some episodic knowledge about James Bartlett, too. James Bartlett rescued the kitten, and James Bartlett caused the accident. And there are a whole bunch of other things about him that we know. Now, how do we know this? Okay, well, one way we know this is from or the work on retrieval from person memory using a particular kind of paradigm first introduced by John Anderson a long time ago in an experiment in which he asked the subjects, I don't think this is on your preliminary version of but we only have a couple of these, in an experiment in which he asked the subjects simply to learn a set of simple declarative facts about people in various locations. Really stupid stimulus materials, okay? The doctor is in the bank, the fireman is in the park, the lawyer is in the church, and the lawyer is in the park. Notice what the structure of this experiment is. There's only one fact about the doctor, and there's only one fact about the bank. There are two facts about the lawyer, and there are two facts about the park. So you're learning these facts, you're accumulating this knowledge about firemen and lawyers and churches and parks. You're memorizing these sentences to a criterion. You're memorizing these sentences to a criterion of perfect recall. You know this list of facts cold. You can do it in your sleep. Okay? Then Anderson gives you a recognition test in which you have to recognize those statements that you've memorized, like the doctor is in the bank, compared to similar statements that you didn't memorize, like the doctor is in the park. Nobody ever makes a mistake in this task, okay? That's because the list has been memorized. So what Anderson is interested in is response latency. How long does it take people to recognize studied targets as studied targets? And when you do the experiment, you get what Anderson christened the fan effect in retrieval from episodic memories, okay? So, for example, here we have item type, targets and locations. The doctor is in the park, and you've got targets where you've only got one fact about the target, or you've memorized 2 facts about the target, or you've memorized 3 facts about the target. 1 fact about locations, 2 facts about a location, 3 facts about a location. This is called, it's the fan effect in part because notice what happens. The more knowledge you have about a target or a location, the longer it takes you to retrieve any particular fact about that individual. These may look like small differences, but they're big differences in the world of cognitive psychology. They're huge differences. So if you only know 1 fact about the target, the doctor is in the bank or whatever, okay, you retrieve that piece of information quickly. If you've got 3 facts, the lawyer is in the church, the lawyer is in the bank, the lawyer is in the park, it takes you longer to verify any one of those facts. I'll get to you in a second, okay? Now, this is evidence, Anderson claims, for a structure that looks kind of like this. You've learned 1 fact about the doctor, that the doctor is in the bank. You've learned 1 fact about the fireman, that the fireman is in the park, but you've learned 2 facts about the lawyer, that he's in the park and he's in the church. The model of episodic memory basically says that if you want to retrieve some information, you activate the lawyer node, and then activation spreads down these associated nodes until you get to the church and to the park. Knowledge about the lawyer is fanning out from the lawyer node. That's where the fan effect comes from. And the more knowledge that fans out, the longer it's going to take to verify any particular knowledge, because you got to search down each of these associative links. The fan effect is important because it shows us that, at least from the point of view of an associative network model of memory, our knowledge about people is represented in a form that looks something looks something like that. You had a question? The fan effect fails under some circumstances when the items become linked. Have you taken Psych 122? Okay, well that's good, because that's something you would discuss in Psych 122. You got it from someplace else. It all depends on the nature of the items, okay? If the items are linked together or they're associated together, the fan effect can be abolished if they're all somehow related to each other, okay? That's right. Unfortunately, that abolition of the fan effect, this is going on way too long, that the abolition of that fan effect only occurs when you don't count false positives against the person, okay? That's technical detail. If you post this on the website forum, I'll give you a really nice, long, detailed answer, okay? But it doesn't really undercut the basic fan effect, okay? I promise you. I wouldn't intentionally teach you something that was not right, okay? But mostly, what I want you to do is to get an idea about kind of how we know about these kinds of things, okay? So here, again, seems to be a structure in which a node representing the lawyer is associatively linked to nodes representing various kinds of locations. This is just kind of a very simple model for how we represent our knowledge about people. Let's look at another aspect of this. It's really quite interesting. This is work, again, by John Anderson and Reed Hasty, in which we're going to learn some facts, okay? Just like the earlier study, except we're not talking about parks and banks and churches anymore. First you learn James Bartlett rescued the kitten, okay? And you learn James Bartlett adopted the child. Then you learn the lawyer caused the accident. And then you learn that the lawyer cursed the salesgirl. So now we've got 2 facts about James Bartlett, and we've got 2 facts about the lawyer, and presumably they're represented in an associative network structure in just the same way that I described before. Now you learn James Bartlett is the lawyer. Okay? Now, what do you know about James Bartlett that you didn't know before? You know that James Bartlett caused the accident, and you know that James Bartlett cursed the salesgirl. What do you know about the lawyer that you didn't know before? You know that the lawyer rescued the kitten and the lawyer adopted the child. So now, how do these two different sets of facts get put together in your representation of James Bartlett, right? Now that you've learned these new things. First, remember, first you establish these pieces of knowledge, and then you got to put them together. Well, one way to think about this is that we've just got two separate representations. One for James Bartlett, who rescued the kitten and adopted the child, and one for the lawyer who cursed the salesgirl and caused the accident. Now that's fine, except if I now ask you, did James Bartlett curse the salesgirl? You have no way of answering yes to that question because you have no way of getting from James Bartlett to the salesgirl. We got to put these representations together somehow. Okay? So one way to do that is to, again, use that technical term, glom the one representation on top of the other, so that we now know that James Bartlett is the lawyer, and James Bartlett rescued the kitten and adopted the child and cursed the salesgirl and caused the accident. Okay? That would allow us to verify the fact is true that James Bartlett cursed the salesgirl, even though that's not a fact that we learned. The other way to represent this is to form a link between the representations we formed to begin with. James Bartlett rescued the kitten and adopted the child. The lawyer cursed the salesgirl and caused the accident. And James Bartlett is the lawyer. Okay? Now, how would we know which of these is true? We do it by looking at response latencies. How long does it take people to verify the fact that James Bartlett cursed the salesgirl? 1.2, right, okay. If there's a single representation for James Bartlett, then it'll take you no longer to retrieve the fact that James Bartlett cursed the salesgirl than it will to retrieve the fact that James Bartlett rescued the kitten, because there's only one associative link separating them, okay? But if we've linked two separate representations, it's going to take you longer to verify that James Bartlett cursed the salesgirl because you got to pass through this second associative link. See the logic? Now let's look at the data. Okay, there's the experimental procedure, and here's the data. When people learn before they memorize these facts that James Bartlett is the lawyer, there's no difference in response latency. The real action is when they learn afterwards that James Bartlett is the lawyer. And it turns out it takes people significantly longer when they have to make the inference that James Bartlett cursed the salesgirl than if there's no inference that James Bartlett adopted the child. It takes longer to make that inference than it does to retrieve the fact, the original fact, and presumably that's because you have to traverse down that extra node. So what we've got here, okay, is evidence for a particular model of person memory. Let's go back here for a second. Evidence that supports this linking of representations rather than the alternative idea, which is a perfectly good idea, that we simply glom the one representation onto the other so that now all these facts fan out. Okay, so now we have some sense of how persons are represented in memory from the point of view of these associative network models of memory. You've got a node representing a person, whether it's James Bartlett or the lawyer, okay? You've got nodes that represent facts about that person, his behaviors, his experiences, his traits, his attitudes, and so on. And then you've got associative links that represent the relations between these individual concepts. James Bartlett is generous. James Bartlett adopted the child. James Bartlett cursed the schoolgirl, the salesgirl, or whatever. This is how we think about the representation of person knowledge in memory. Okay. So, again, if the reference is known at the outset, if before you learn any facts about James Bartlett or the lawyer, I tell you, I just want you to know, you're going to learn some facts about James Bartlett and you're going to learn some facts about the lawyer, and now I want you to know, bear in mind that James Bartlett is the lawyer. If you know that at the outset, you create a single representation that has all of these facts associated with a single James Bartlett node. But if, after learning separate facts about James Bartlett and about the lawyer, I then tell you, by the way, it just so happens that James Bartlett is the lawyer, we get this linked representation. So this representation stays in memory. This representation stays in memory. What happens when I tell you, by the way, James Bartlett is the lawyer, you say, ah, James Bartlett is the lawyer. You establish a new link that connects these two nodes. Again, I'm doing this in part because I think these experiments are cool, which is, I think, my problem, okay? But also because this is how we do cognitive psychology, and this is how we do social cognition when we're trying to derive the, use computer simulations or things like that as a medium for writing theories and for testing propositions and for testing hypotheses. This is exactly the way a memory psychologist would think about the representation of memory underlying list learning or sentence learning or story learning kinds of procedures, and we can use exactly those same kinds of methods and exactly the same kind of theoretical apparatus to understand how our knowledge about people is represented in memory. We can use the same associative network format to represent our knowledge about individual people, James Bartlett, John, Lucy, the salesgirl, all these people, as we do for representing our knowledge about cars and trucks and birds and fish and trees and flowers and all those other things that we know something about. Next time, after the weekend, after the holiday, we're going to continue this, but we're going to ask a really, really, really interesting question, which is, given that we know things about people in general, that James Bartlett is kind and James Bartlett is ambitious, and that we know things about people in particular, that James Bartlett rescued the kitten and that James Bartlett went up early for tenure, how do we represent trait knowledge about a person, knowledge about a person's generalized personality traits and attitudes, together with knowledge about his or her specific experiences and behaviors? Put another way, how do we connect up what we know generically about a person, if you will, our semantic memory about an individual, with our specific knowledge of his or her behaviors and experiences? How do we put episodic and semantic memory together? That's what we'll do next Wednesday. Have a good weekend, a long weekend. Have a good holiday. Remember your presidents, and we'll see you on Wednesday. Thank you very much.